Alright, here we are again, still with our discussion on poetry. But for today's discussion, we'll be looking at textual analysis, structure, and form. So in this presentation, we'll be talking about structure a little bit more thoroughly. We're going to be looking at form. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the limerick and the Shakespearean sonnet. So make sure you are taking notes so you can receive those bonus XP points. So here we go. First thing we're going to talk about is structure and form. So when we look at structure, when you look at a poem, whether it's in class or for an essay, there's a bunch of different ways that you have to explore the structure of the poem. So generally speaking, of course, you know that the poem is structured in verses. There are specific lines in the structure. So, for example, in a Shakespearean sonnet, which we'll be analyzing later on, there's a specific structure in terms of the lines, the number of verses, the rhyme scheme, etc., etc. So, and with that, there's a reason for that structure. So we're going to look at some different forms and structures as it relates to poetry. Alright, so first thing we're going to look at are the verses. So when you're analyzing a poem's structure, these are the questions that you have to ask yourself, because this is how we delve deep into a poem. First of all, you look at the verses or the stanzas. How many are there? How long is each one? Are their verses all the same length? Then you look at the punctuation. Does each verse end with a full stop or not? How does the punctuation affect the flow of the poem? The punctuation is very important in a poem because the punctuation lets you know whether or not you need to pause, or is the line ending, and it also allows you to gain the full effect of the poem. Then you also, as we talked about before, we look at the rhyme pattern. Is there a consistent rhyme pattern? Does it affect the structure of the flow of the poem? And then finally you look at the storyline. Does each verse contain a particular part of the story, or does the storyline run throughout the poem? And all these things tie into the structure of the poem. Alright, so let's look at some more points dealing with structure. And this is an example of a poem that has been annotated. It's called The Crossing Bar. So we're going to look at this poem and analyze the structure. So the first thing you should notice is that each verse has 4 lines. You can see that here. Line 1 and 3, as you notice, rhyme in every verse. So you have star and bar in line 3. And then verse 1 ends with a comma, which means that idea is continuous. And then it also shows that it's ending same kind of flow in line 4. And lines 2 and 4 rhyme in every verse. So the way it should read is sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. So now when you look at the punctuation, you look at the form and the structure, you can hear a clear rhyme in the poem. And that's created by the punctuation, the number of words in the line, the punctuation marks, and things of that nature. And then again, verse 2 ends with a full stop. So you have the first stanza with the continuous idea, and then you have the period at the end, and the exclamation mark here in stanza 1 for effect and significance. Alright, let's move on. So here's another poem. We'll look at the structure here. So you have exclamation marks are used at the end of the 2nd and the 10th lines. Here, verse 3 ends with a semicolon here, which means it's a continuation. There's some point that's going to be made with that idea. And verse 4 ends with a full stop. All right, so that deals with the structure. So once you've annotated, annotating a poem is a very good idea because then it allows you to think and reflect about the effect of the structure that it creates. So here, the verses each have 4 lines. This creates some sort of a rhythmic pattern, particularly in conjunction with the rhyme scheme, as we noticed before. It also breaks up the poem into 4 clear sections and tells a story. But also note that, however, the impact this break is lessened somewhat by the use of a comma at the end of the verse and 1 semicolon at the end of the verse 3. And we also notice that line 1 and 3 rhyme in every verse. All right, continuing on. In the next poem, verse 1 ended with a comma. Because there was no comma, the reader moves into the second verse with only a slight pause. Whereas if we been a full stop, the 4 lines of regular rhyme scheme would have created a very definite end to each verse. So there's a definite flow. All right, and we already talked about how lines 2 and 4 rhymed. Again, here's some more annotated notes dealing with the structure of the poem, pointing out how the exclamation marks are used at the end of the 2nd and 10th lines to express surprise or shock. Because they're followed by the word and, exclamation mark do not denote the end of a sentence, but rather an exclamation or expression of the poet's feelings. All right. So again, they use a semicolon because there's no full stop. You're pulled into the fourth verse with only a slight pause to let you know that the expression of the idea is being continued into that last verse. All right. So now we're going to talk about form. And this was talked a little bit about in our last video. There are several forms of poems, and each form of a poem has its own kind of set of requirements and formats that are traditionally followed by writers. Each one has specific point of lines, rhyme pattern. So the 4 we're going to talk about briefly in this video are the ballad, the limerick, and the haiku. And we'll look at some examples followed by the Shakespearean sonnet, which we've already looked at. So, the first one is the limerick. Very comical 5-line poem that follows an A-B rhyme scheme. So we'll look. So there was an old lady from Wales, line A, who loved to eat her garden snails. A again. But she felt quite unwell, a B line rhyme scheme, when she crunched on a shell, B, and now she sticks to the tails. A. So it follows that A-A-B-B-A rhyme scheme. So there it is. This is letter A rhyme, another A, and all 3 of these lines rhyme. And then you have the 3rd and 4th line, which is your B lines. All right, so let's look. So it has a specific meter, the limerick, and an internal rhyme or internal rhythm, which is created by the number of syllables and the stress. So we'll see how this works. There was an old lady from Wales. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the emphasis is on the 2nd, 5th, and 8th syllables. Who loved to eat her garden snails. Again, the emphasis on the 2nd, the 5th, and the 8th syllable. But she felt quite unwell. Here the emphasis is on syllables 3 and 6, where she crunched on a shell. Same emphasis here, 3 and 6. And then the last one, same emphasis for the last line. Emphasis is on the 2nd, the 5th, and the 8th syllable, which go hand in hand with lines 1 and 2. So while they have the same rhyme scheme, they also have the same amount of syllables as well. All right. So they're supposed to be fun, easy to write. We're not going to write one here. But we'll look at the Shakespearean sonnet. Shakespearean sonnet, obviously written by William Shakespeare, is a form of a sonnet. He wrote many different sonnets. So the typical format or form is this 14 lines, and the rhyme scheme is A B A B C D C D E F E F and G G. It's written in iambic pentameter, and it ends with a rhyming couplet, which means what? The last two lines rhyme. So here is an example of the Shakespearean sonnet. As you can see, well, let's go. We'll talk about it. And this is an example of how it's annotated to show you the rhyme scheme. So here's line A. The first and the third lines rhyme. So you have A B, A B, and here's your C, your two C's, your two D's. So every other line rhymes with each other until we get down to lines G. So you can see the pattern still continues. E F, E F. And then you have your couplet at the end, which is G, G. And those two rhyme together. Alright, so that concludes our discussion on form and structure. For the next time, we'll look at storyline and viewpoint. Hopefully you took a number of notes, and make sure you turn it in Edmodo.